Hello, everyone. Wow, today is a very exciting Wednesday for us all. Yes, because I am joined by the wonderful Caitlyn Greffly. Yay! Super exciting because Caitlyn is a former bootcamp student who transitioned from selling beer to software engineer. And that's even better because it rhymes. Yeah. And she's here today to share her wisdom on making the switch successfully, no matter what industry you're coming from or your experience level. And we're going to talk specifically about nailing the job hunt, successful networking, building a knockout portfolio, what to expect when interviewing, and much, much more. And of course, your questions. Yes, we do these things live, so you can ask your questions in the chat, and we will try to respond to as many as possible. But first, a very big welcome to Caitlyn. Hey. Thanks for coming, Caitlyn. Lovely to have you here. Lots of people
thanks for having me
in the chat. Also happy to see you. So, yeah.
Hi everyone.
Yeah. It's exciting, actually, because our CTO was the one who recommended that I invite you as a guest. So thank you to Froda for the great recommendation.
Awesome. Yeah.
And so let's begin by talking a bit about your background. So I mentioned selling beer to software engineer. How did you decide to make that transition, and what was your path to doing it?
Well, I think it's a pretty clear path. I mean, they're so related, those fields. No, they're not at all. I started by getting my bachelor's degree in psychology. So started on a totally different path. Graduated college kind of in the time of the recession. And so I ended up being a beer tender, a bartender at the beer bar, which kind of led me into an accidental career in beer, which I was in for about 7 years, actually. And I got to a point where I was ready to move on from that industry. I was just traveling a lot. There's definitely like a lot of party energy in that industry, which is fun for a while. And then I got burnt out. And I really had no idea that I was going to end up being a software engineer. It didn't seem like me, I guess. I'm extroverted. I like talking to people. You know, I was like in sales. I like travel and all that stuff. And I just always had this idea of a software engineer being someone like sitting in a dark room, like taking apart their computer in their spare time. And so it was like kind of a funny path for me to even end up realizing this would be something I'd be interested in. I liked data analytics in my career in beer. That was something that I did as part of my presentations, was kind of analyze how beer was selling in different areas and present that. And so I started to like look down the path of doing data analytics as a career. And I got rejected from a data analytics bootcamp because I didn't know how to code. And I was really surprised by that because I just thought, why would I need that? And then I started messing around with coding, and a week or two later, I started the coding bootcamp. And then by the time 6 months, by the time I was almost done with that, was when I was starting my first job. So it was kind of like a happy accident that I ended up here.
Yeah, very interesting. And Michael is saying, I too am making the switch from bartender to developer. I'm sure lots of people in the chat can relate to switching from another career into code. Actually, I was a bartender as well. So we're all bartenders at heart. Yeah.
I feel like as a bartender, especially, you are great with dealing with all kinds of different people, and you probably have really good communication skills. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
Absolutely. That brings me on to an interesting question I wanted to ask you, which was, how did you present your skills from your previous career when you were looking for a software job?
I think the one I leaned really heavily on was communication. It seemed more obvious to me with my background in psychology, like being an extrovert, coming from sales. I just felt, I mean, I'm like a talkative person. So I kind of like twisted that and I was like communicative, great at communication, not just chatty. And so that was, at the time, I think that was just the one that I really leaned on to say that like this is something that could be really helpful. I think since I've gotten into the industry, I've realized more ways that my past lives have helped me in the industry. I think someone pointed out to me like just like a year ago was I realized I was really interested in UX. I'm mostly a front end software engineer at this point, and I just love UX. I love thinking about what the user's thinking and like what works best for them. And someone was like, that probably comes from your degree in psychology. Like you like thinking about how people think and what they're going to do. And I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. Of course it does. So that was another line I figured out. I was recently talking to my boss about how I'm one of those weird people who likes giving presentations. I like doing public speaking. And he was like, that will come in handy because that's not something that everyone likes to do. So I think like the further I've gotten into it, there's like so many ways that no matter what career you're coming from, so many talents you can bring to the team. Like when I look at the software engineering teams I'm on, I feel like people think like you need to be a good coder and like, yeah, you are going to write some code if you're a developer. But there's so many different aspects of the job. And I feel like having a team with people from different backgrounds is like a really good way to have just a well-rounded team that's going to be able to tackle everything. So that's something I try and talk to engineering managers about. But if you're trying to break into the field, I think that's just something you can point out. Like, I think a cover letter is actually a really good place too, even though cover letters are kind of the worst and I hate writing them. It's a good place to draw the line of like, this is my previous career and this is the skills that I built that will help me, so that they don't have to kind of guess how your skill set might be relevant. And yeah, just think about what you do. Like if you're a bartender, you're talking to people, you're multitasking, you're probably working at a really fast-paced environment. And so if you're applying to a team, you can say like, I'm used to working at a fast pace and having things change all the time. And that's a great attribute for a developer to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned briefly that you joined a bootcamp fairly quickly after kind of discovering coding, if I understood correctly. And Patty is asking how you became a software engineer. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your bootcamp and what it actually involved and what it was like.
Yeah. So first of all, I don't have a degree that's relevant to being a software engineer. I know it. So in the US, if your employer calls you a software engineer, you are one, regardless of your educational background. I've heard it's different in other countries. I'm not totally positive, but here in my first job, my employer called me an associate software engineer. So I was one, and that's been my title, various levels ever since. And the boot camp, so the boot camp I did was 6 months long. It was, the first 3 months was like 20 to 25 hours a week of work that I put in. The last 3 months, I felt like I just like eat, sleep, breathe, coding and trying to find a new job. It just felt like it consumed my life a little more. That also was possibly because I had quit my full-time job at that point in the second half of my boot camp. So I could really focus on all the other things. Like the boot camp is one thing that will help you get a job. But there's just, we'll get into it later, but that's why I wrote a book. There's a lot of other things that you'll need to do to actually get that first job, like building a community or networking, like trying to figure out how to write a resume when you have zero relevant experience and like all that kind of stuff. It just felt like it took a lot more time in the second half of my boot camp. But I mean, that was mainly what I did. It was 6 months of the boot camp. I did some like supplemental materials on the side. So like courses outside of my boot camp, just like, like YouTube videos, that kind of thing, West Boss. And between all those things, I was able to land a first job at a company that was happy to hire someone from a boot camp. So I think that made a big difference. I know more companies seem to be opening up to that now, but they were very supportive and knew that I didn't have necessarily a traditional computer science background. And I was productive pretty fast at that company. So I think companies that hire juniors realize that they're going to be awesome for the team.
Perfect. Which brings me on nicely to a question from Arja. We're asking actually two questions. How were you able to get your first job in the field? And the one that caught my eye is, do you think your skill set was sufficient for your job at the time? So in other words, did the boot camp prepare you for the realities of the job, I guess?
Yeah, I'll start with that one first. God, I mean, you learn so much in a boot camp so fast, and then you get into a job and a lot is different. I think the boot camp taught me like a new way to think. I think it like kind of created new pathways in my brain of like how to speak the language of coding. And then I also think it taught me skills like I remember the first time in my boot camp that I came across something that I like really didn't know how to do. I think I was making a quiz. I was making a Harry Potter quiz, and I wanted to go from one question to the next question, all the way to the end. And I just could not, for the life of me, figure out how to go from one question to the next question. I was, a couple weeks into my boot camp. And I remember thinking like, this is actually impossible. I have no idea. I'm never going to figure this out. And I had the help of a mentor in my program, but of course I did figure it out. And I think that was such a big like life lesson for me in this field, because oh my God, since then I've probably come across 1,000 things that when the first time I see it, I think this has got to be like actually impossible. And then by the end of it, suddenly I've done it. And so I think I just like, that was one of the big skills is like, don't take that little voice inside you too seriously, and know how to like, when you see something that's impossible, know where to start with that, like know how to break that problem down and start to move forward. Know when you're really stuck and you need to ask for help, and know what resources you have to like draw from. Know how to Google. I feel like figuring out how to Google, that sounds like so easy, something we should all know. I don't think I was Googling very well in the beginning. And so I think like those were the skills I really took from my boot camp. My boot camp was in one set of languages. My first job was in a completely different set. So I didn't know much in the beginning. I think 5 minutes ago, I said I was productive early on. I was like, very, very small amount of like I felt productive. I felt like a productive member of the team. And I think that's probably more to do with my teammates and the company culture than it is what I was adding. But I felt productive. I did. And I think for the first few months, it's hard to imagine that someone is paying you a salary to do what I felt was like as little as I was doing. Because you're like, I'm still learning the basics. Like a senior could do this in 1 second. But then again, like you don't want that team manager doesn't necessarily want to pay a senior to do something they could do in 1 second. They've got other things to do. And my manager also pointed out to me that having a junior on the team is like great for seniors' mentoring abilities. So that helps them grow as developers. So I don't think my skill was like, it wasn't great, but I think it was sufficient. And I think I was really excited to grow and learn. And that attitude seemed to serve me well on my team. And I got to a point where I did feel like a real contributing member of the team. So you just have to kind of like push through in the beginning and like I hope that all of y'all end up on very supportive teams, because I feel like that can make such a big difference on how you're able to like really grow and feel confident as a software engineer. And then, okay, the first part of the question.
Yeah.
So my first job in the field, in my boot camp, there was a woman that I met. She was part of the staff of the boot camp, who I worked directly with for maybe a month, and then she moved to a different position, but we kept in touch. She lived in my area, and towards the end, she had a friend who was an engineering manager, and she suggested that I apply for a job at this person's company. And that was kind of my foot in the door there. I don't think I ever would have necessarily applied for that role, because like I said, it was completely different languages than I was working in. So I think having her give me that introduction really helped. My manager told me after the fact that there were 200 resumes in that pile. And I think that helped me just get in at the first, like, just get my foot in the door, get to that first interview. And I think from there, probably I was on my own. But I think that is why people say network and connections are very helpful. And I went through the whole interview process, which we can talk about in detail a little more later. But yeah, I really kind of credit that woman for giving me that introduction and suggesting I apply for that role.
Yeah, that is extremely interesting, especially as you say, you probably wouldn't have applied for it just because it was completely different languages. So, of course, you're naturally going to gravitate towards jobs with languages you already know. But it just goes to show what networking can do for you. So, let's talk a little bit about networking now, because that is something featured in your book, which is here, the Boot Campus Companion. And before we get on to networking, would you like to tell us a bit about who this book is for and what it contains and what inspired you to create it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first person I kind of wrote this book for was me, like 3 years ago. When I went from my boot camp to my first job, or when I was going through my boot camp, when I transitioned to my first job, like when I was looking for my first job, all that time, I felt like I was learning so much in my boot camp. And yet I felt like there was like simple things that I just like had no idea what people were talking about. Like the different kinds of roles you can have in tech that I was super unfamiliar with, like a scrum master, like a product manager versus a project manager, like all these things. And then people would be dropping names of all kinds of different technologies, like, oh, would you want a job in Java? And I was like, well, I do JavaScript. Is that the same? And they're like, no. And there was just like, there was a lot of jargon that I didn't understand. There was like, I was like, what would I actually do in this, like a day in the life as a software engineer? Right now, all I'm doing is like just writing code nonstop. Is that what this job actually looks like? And then also just like, how do I like actually get a job? I feel like the bootcamp gave me some path forward and like how to meet other people in the industry. But I kind of figured that out a little bit as I went. And also with my sales background, I do happen to be very comfortable, like kind of cold calling people. And so I really dug into kind of sleuthing the internet and chatting with people. But anyway, I felt like there was just a lot of those, like, not necessarily soft skills, but like, not like this book is not like, there's not code in this book. It's more about like the other things that you need to know. And there was just so much that I felt like I just didn't learn in my boot camp. And I've had a lot of conversations with aspiring developers since I became a software engineer. And I noticed the same questions coming up for them a lot. And after I would meet with them, I would write them these long emails with everything I could think of that would be helpful. And the emails kept getting longer and longer. And eventually I was like, you know what, I should just compile everything I know and try and make it helpful. And yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up with the book.
Perfect. Yes. And Caitlyn has very kindly given us a little Scrimba promo discount on the book. So you can hit the link I've just put in the chat, and it's also in the description box to grab that discount. Yeah. So you told us just now how it was one of your connections that helped you get that first job in the industry. Do you have any advice for people starting out in tech on how they can begin what some people dread, which is networking?
I know. I know that people hate that word. That's why the chapter in my book is called Building a Community, because I feel like it's a slightly, like, it changes the way you think about it. I think when I think of networking, I think of these very like stuffy conversations. I think of like connecting with someone for the sole purpose of getting a job, and then if you don't, it's like a failed connection or something. And I think that even though if you're an aspiring developer, all you want is that job, in theory, I think there's so much you can get just from connecting with other people and building the community around you. And you never know which of those connections is going to be helpful in the end. So I go through this in massive detail in the book, but I liked to look for companies I was interested in working for. And then I would look at all their employees, and I would try and filter out those employees until I found someone that I had some things in common with. Like maybe they had a boot camp education. Maybe they went to the same undergrad university as I did. Maybe, I don't know, they liked volleyball. And I would try and kind of find someone who I felt like if I could see myself in them, if I could be like, oh, I could be that person one day, maybe they'd look at me and see that familiarity in me too, and be interested in my request to connect. And then I'd ask to have a coffee chat. And I think at that point, like, I had a coffee chat recently with someone, and they were so well prepared for it. And it like took me aback at how like impressive that was, and how that made me think of them in like such a positive light, because I've had coffee chats that like range from someone who's just like, hello, like, tell me what you know, to someone who's like, hey, I've like listened to your interviews, I've read your blogs, like I'm really interested in this specific thing in your career, can you share more about that? And I think it just showed me from this side of the table how great it is to kind of come to those coffee chats prepared, and again, able to like draw the connections between you and that person. I also think that if you reach out to people that are at companies you're interested in, whether they're hiring for a position that you could be in or not, then you kind of become front of mind for them. I know multiple people who did that, and the person they met with was like, you know, we were talking about hiring a junior, but we just haven't posted it yet. We haven't gotten around to it, but like, it's so great to meet you. I feel like you'd be a good fit for the team. And they end up getting hired into that company. And then you don't have to be one resume in a stack of 200, which feels like a game of just chance at a certain point. So yeah, I think for networking, I think like, don't be afraid to reach out, but reach out with like a clear purpose, and make it clear in the message that you write to someone that this is not like a copy and pasted message that you write to everyone. Like, write something specific to them and be organized with it. I think like, I need a calendar invite or else I'm going to forget. So like, be sure to just, follow up with them and say like, I'd love to get this on your calendar. If there's a time that works for you, here are a couple times that work for me, or like, let me email you, and like be the one who's like leading the charge on it. I also think that there's great online platforms for building a community. I found a huge community on Twitter. Tech Twitter, I feel like there's negative everywhere on the internet, but I've had 95% positive experiences in the tech Twitter community. And that was especially true early on when I was asking for help. Like, I remember when I started learning React and I was like, this makes no sense. I have no idea what's going on here. I need something extra to get me through my boot camp. And people were so happy to like share resources. People reached out to me and said, if you ever want to talk about React, I'm happy to chat. And that like learning in public on Twitter and then asking for help and taking advantage of the fact that people on the internet love to share what they know, I think is like a great resource when you're learning. And if you're a software engineer, you're always learning. So I think that's another great way. And yeah, I think just like the biggest thing is just like putting yourself out there. It can be so scary in any walk of life, but when you're in a new career with like a lot of new lingo, even me as an extrovert and someone coming from sales, I remember being terrified at conferences and in my first conversations with people that someone was going to say something that I didn't understand and I would sound like an idiot. And that happened. I mean, I survived. So I would just say, just push through it. Just try and put yourself out there. You're going to meet so many people that are going to end up being helpful because there's a lot more people coming from less traditional educational backgrounds at this point. And I know when I meet someone who's going through like a boot camp, I'm like so excited to chat with them. And like, I know what they're going through. I know that they probably don't understand like a lot of the jargon that I take for granted. And I'm usually like stoked to be helpful. So I think there's a lot of, and I learned that from other people acting like that towards me. Like I am paying it forward at this point. So yeah.
Perfect. That sounds great. Tons of questions coming into the chat. Keep them coming. I will ask them. Well, as many as I can. Sometimes I get overwhelmed with questions, but excellent that you are asking them. One question which caught my eye was from Tropica, asking, were you looking for your place in a company, or did you simply kind of send your CV anywhere just to get a job? So I think what Tropica's getting at is, did you narrow down your search to companies that aligned with your values or you just liked more, or did you go for a wider approach, or did you manage to skip any of that stage because of your connections? How did it work out for you?
I will say that the job I got was not the first I applied for or interviewed for. And I think I started out with like a list of my favorite companies that I was really interested in working for, either because I thought they were doing something cool or like I had met someone from there and they seemed really nice, or just because they had like really cool offices. And so that's kind of like where I started. I did not end up at a company that was on like any of those lists. And it still worked out great. But they were making corporate legal e-discovery software. And that was not like something that I A, knew anything about, or B, had any particular interest in. But I think I sort of knew this as I was looking for a job. And after having a very positive experience with my first job, I feel like the important thing to look for is like a supportive team. So then it's like, how do you do that? I think one of the things, like when you're on LinkedIn and you're looking at people that currently work at the company, I would be nervous. I mean, depending on the company or if you know someone from there, but I would be nervous to go have my first job at a company where none of the software engineers had a less traditional educational background. Like if everyone has a computer science degree, unless you're talking to a hiring manager who's like, we really want to branch out, we're making an intentional move to do so. If they've never seen someone come out of a boot camp, they might have unrealistic expectations and it might end up not being the most supportive environment. Not 100% of the time, but that for me was something that I wanted to make sure, I wanted to be clear that I was coming from a boot camp. I wasn't trying to hide it. And also make sure that they and their team was supportive of that. I think there's also some questions you can ask during the interview process to gauge this, like once you're at the interview stage, in my first 2 jobs, I like to ask, like, is your team excited about being like a mentor to a junior or supporting a junior? Like, how does your team feel about that? How does your team actually do that? And from those answers, you can kind of gauge whether there's like, I feel like there's some teams that are like, oh, we have to like bring on someone new and young. Like, I don't want to do that. That's just going to take away time from, my 10x developer life or whatever it is. And I liked to hear answers that was like, yes, like we've done this before. We love bringing on juniors. Like it's a great learning experience for everybody, like that kind of thing. And you can kind of gauge what the team culture might be. And so I think that was like one way that I kind of like filtered where I sent my resume. And I did look, I remember I kind of like leaned on Glassdoor reviews. I don't know if that's a thing in other countries, but it's where like there's just reviews, of the company you're working for. Yeah. And I kind of like set like a base level where I was like, I don't really want to work anywhere that has less than like a 3-star rating or something. Or if I read the reviews and kind of get a gut feeling for whether or not people are happy there, if there's a good work-life balance, if they're treated well. So for me, that was kind of how I filtered it in my first role, especially.
Perfect. And I think that's really important to remember, because that first tech role, a lot of people have a feeling that they just need to get anything and just take whatever comes along. But as you alluded to earlier, the team you end up on, especially for your first role, is so important. And if you're not going to be comfortable there, it's just going to make your life really miserable. So asking you a question like the one you mentioned about how the team feels about having a junior, I think that's a great tip. Fortunate is doing a boot camp, or has just done it, has just left a 6-month boot camp. Congratulations, Fortunate. Is asking how to deal with the 2 years experience requirement you often see on job ads for junior developers.
Ignore it. I feel like if they're saying 2 years, they're saying no years. They're saying entry level. I don't know why job postings always overstate what is required for a job. The job that I have now was originally posted as a senior role and with like 5+ years experience. And I had a little over 2 years experience. And again, not in the stack that's used, not in the technologies that are used at the company. And they hired me. I didn't get hired as a senior, but I still got hired because they were like, we were just looking for someone for the team and we posted for a senior. And I just feel like that happens so often. And companies, I don't know why. 2 years to me it's you, Fortunate. I say go for it. Ignore the 2 years. I think in general, they say if you meet at least 50% of the requirements for a job, go ahead and apply. I think as a junior, anything that's like 2 years, definitely go ahead and apply. I would say at least if you've like worked in a couple of the technologies, you're probably good to go. But I'm also proof that you could have worked in none of the technologies and have a chance. And then I think 3 years and up is when they're looking for someone with like a little bit of experience. I think my second job, when I had a year, I think that job asked for 3 years. So they're always overstating by 2 years. I don't know why they do it, but apply.
Yeah, totally agree. As Debjit says, junior is 0 to 1 years of experience. Completely agree there, Debjit. If they're asking for 2+ years, they're not really looking for a junior, in my opinion. So yes, hope that has helped, Fortunate, and best of luck with your job search. Debjit also says, you will never be ready for the job. You have to learn on the job. Debjit is 1 year in and still learning every day. And that is a great point, because
so true.
Even people who have been in the industry, say 10 years or whatever, a new technology comes along and they've basically got the same experience as someone with no experience, because it's completely new. So don't let that put you off. And hopefully Caitlyn's tale here about not knowing the language she was using in her first job will inspire you to keep going, even if you don't know. Yeah, perfect. A few people in the chat are asking about your interview preparation techniques and interview experiences. Now, your book does have a section about interviews. Mm-hmm. How can we make sure that we're ready for the interview process?
Oh my gosh, the interview process in tech is challenging. I think I've gone through a lot of interviews. Like even recently, about 6 months ago when I landed the job that I'm in now, I went through a lot of interviews leading up to getting that job. And the interview process in tech is just, there's such a range of things that you can expect. And so I kind of went through the different paths you might take and all the different kinds of interviews there are. In terms of like what I do to prepare, like even as kind of a mid-level engineer, when I know that I'm going to have a live coding session as part of an interview, which just fills me with anxiety and dread, I will go back to focusing on the basics, because I find that if I feel extremely comfortable in basics, then I'll be able to like at least have some sort of path forward on whatever problem they give me. And working in the field, I feel like I don't have a ton of practice in basics, weirdly, because you're kind of doing a variety of things and you're not always just doing like for loops every day. And so I think almost like as I probably practice the same way for interviews now as I should have done as a junior. I don't know if I did this a ton in the beginning, but I would recommend it to anyone trying to break into the field. I used free code camp. Like, honestly, those exercises, they're just like, it's just, yeah, it's like a for loop. It's how to like access any item in an array, like working with objects, just as like simple things come up in so many of the live coding interviews that I've done. And sometimes like my mind will go blank. Like even if I've, been a software engineer for 2.5 years, and there was like a question recently on just like, yeah, accessing an object. And I just went blank because it wasn't something I had done anytime recently. And so that's why for me, studying the basics is such a big thing for that kind of technical interview. And I also think in general in the interview process, I'm a big fan of just controlling what you can control, which is like, you can't control what they're going to ask you. They could ask you anything under the sun, but you can control your mindset. You can control your attitude. Usually the person that's giving you these interviews is someone you're going to be working directly with on the team. And I always think like, even if I don't know what I'm doing, like I want to be someone that they would want to work with. Like if I'm like, oh, like what is this problem? Like what's this bug? Like make some jokes, like just have a positive attitude, be really excited to learn, be like, I've never come across this before. I'm like really interested to solve this problem. I think that is what I focus on going into interviews, because it gives me some feeling of control in a situation where I often feel a lack of control. So I think like those are like, yes, you want to be able to write some code in technical interviews. But if you can start with like pseudocode, just write out your thought process, talk through it, have a positive attitude, have like an interest in learning. then I think like, you're already partway there. And then hopefully that relaxes you a little bit and you can kind of get into at least starting to write code. So that's kind of like the technical interview process. There's a lot of like hacker rank challenges out there also for coding. I'm awful at those. At this point I just avoid them. I don't think, like, as a front end engineer, a lot of those I don't think are things that I'm necessarily going to come across in my day to day. I'm not good at them. I'm not going to get good at them anytime soon. I don't know. It's not for me, but I think a lot of people do like really study those and you can get good at them. But if you fail one of those, you're in very good company. I think we've all failed like a hacker rank or leak code style challenge before. But I have some coworkers who swore by doing like one leak code a day, one exercise a day leading up to technical interviews, and they were awesome at it. And I think that's great. Other interviews in terms of measuring tech skill, in my first job, I didn't even have to do a technical interview, which was awesome. I loved that. What they did instead was they took the code that I'd written as part of my projects and asked me about it. And then we had conversations about technical processes and different, I don't know, maybe there was kind of a vocab quiz of sorts. But I thought that was a really great process, especially for a junior who it's hard to have anything memorized off the top of your head, no matter what level you're at, but especially for a junior, you just have so much in your head. I think it's really nice to just be able to have a conversation. And then I'm a big fan of the take-home technical interview, which is when you have a coding challenge, but nobody is watching you do it, just standing over your shoulder, making you anxious, and you can do it on your own timeline. And I think these are the interviews that I personally have done very well in. So I think the biggest thing when you're going into the interview process, when you have that first phone call with like HR or something, and they're like, okay, we're going to put you through the next round, ask them as much detail as you can about what to expect in each of the interviews, who's going to be interviewing you, and then you can like stalk them on LinkedIn, what technology you're going to be interviewed in, because you might assume that's the technology that the job is for, and you might be wrong. And then also just, like what the rules are. Some interviews you're allowed to Google during it. Some interviews you're not. And so I think in order to prepare for a wide range of experiences, just try and get as much information out of them as you can. And then just try and find a way to kind of go into the interview being as calm and confident as possible. And the more you do it, even though it sounds crazy, I did like 10 interviews in a row. And the more I failed, the more confident I got, because I was just like, okay, like I've seen all these problems already now 10 times in a row. And I am not as nervous about the process. I got more comfortable in the process, even though I was continuing to fail. So don't be too hard on yourself if you fail, and just look at it as, what another way that you gained experience for the next process.
Yeah, totally. I can relate to that because I've had disastrous interviews in my time. And after that, I dreaded interviews much less because, I've had a complete car crash interview and here I am.
You survived. Yeah.
Not only did I survive, but I also now have a funny story to tell people about the time I went to an interview with toothpaste down my jacket or whatever. So yeah. Totally behind you on that one. What you were saying about for your first job, you were able to talk about code that you'd already written instead of having a technical interview is interesting because Sakile is asking, is it advisable to cite in your CV a YouTube channel where you might show a part of your coding process with regard to a personal project or two? I thought when you mentioned, Caitlyn, about using your bootcamp projects in the interview process, this could translate quite well onto a coding YouTube channel as well. And maybe if you had some of your coding projects up on YouTube or anywhere else publicly, you might even be able to skip the technical interview stage. I have heard of that happening. What's your take on that?
I love that idea. I would love the idea of skipping the technical interview process, but even if sorry, I have a dog who's very dramatic about the mailman. But even if you are just using the YouTube video as a way to show your thought process, and like, because you can look at code and depending on how heavily you've commented it out. Sorry, I don't know how loud this dog is in the background. But
we like animals here.
Yeah, work from home life. But yeah, depending on like your code, they might read it and not be able to get a sense for like why you made the decisions you made. And I think it's really smart to have a video where you describe it, because that could help you get that first interview, even if it doesn't help you skip the technical. Someone who sees that versus just seeing static code will like see your communication skills. They'll kind of see like your cadence, how you think. And I think that like adds an extra layer. I think that's a great idea. Do it.
Yep, perfect. Thank you for the idea there, Sakile. Question here. You mentioned earlier that you were doing your bootcamp alongside working, at least in the beginning. Would you recommend that? How was it for you?
I mean, if you don't have to, don't. I would say that sounds better. I survived. I was lucky enough to have a full-time job that was like kind of a random schedule. And so, and I worked remotely. And because I was in sales, my metrics were tracked differently. It wasn't like I was in an office. I had to be in an office 9 to 5. I think that would be a lot harder if you have to like be at a job certain hours and find other times, because like I said, it was like 20 to 25 hours a week on top of my job that I was learning to code in the beginning. And while that's possible, depending on what else you have going on in your life, that would be a lot. That would be really hard. I think for me, because sometimes I worked nights, sometimes I didn't have to work mornings. I could kind of like, and I became a lot more efficient at my job. My 8-hour days, I ended up being able to get my work done in like 6. And I was able to clock off at that point, clock out. Anyway, so I think it depends on your circumstance. I continued to work because I didn't want to go into debt. And I also wanted to make sure that I was enjoying coding enough, because I had no background in it really. I wanted to kind of get partway in and make sure like, okay, this is really a career I want to pursue. But it was definitely really hard. I think a lot of the people I know who have decided to work full time at the same time as a boot camp, like they might take a little longer to do the boot camp, which is totally okay. Or, you know, maybe you have a lot of help. I know my partner cooked probably every meal for me for 6 months in that time, just because I had no time for silly things like feeding myself. So I think that those like edge things can make a big difference. And even with kind of the positive setup I had for being able to do both, oh man, I still cried a lot. I was stressed out. So I think you just do what works for you and what's important to you.
I think you can also look at that the other way around as well, because things like cooking, as an example, are not things that people generally factor into account. I think you just assume that, one, everyone else is doing it, and two, you're just meant to magically be able to spend half an hour or an hour cooking every night on top of everything else. But the reality is, maybe that's too much. Maybe you do need a little bit of help in that regard, or perhaps take a bit longer on your boot camp, because at the end of the day, we do need to eat. So don't be too hard on yourself. Balancing all of life's billions of responsibilities is my point.
Yeah. definitely.
And Dr. Morpho had an interesting question, which was, what was the most difficult thing in learning according to your feelings?
I think the most difficult thing in learning to code for me was learning to be frustrated and be okay with that and kind of work through that. I think going into coding, I remember someone asked if I was okay with being frustrated. And I was like, not really. And they're like, I don't know if like software engineering's for you. And I like kind of get that, but at the same time, I would never have considered myself someone who was okay with being frustrated. But when it comes to coding challenges, I think it's different. It feels different than being, I don't know, frustrated with something else in life. And it's a skill that I had to learn. So I think just learning to not kind of get down on myself, not shut down, learning how to like push through, learning when to take breaks, I think is super important. Like all these things, no one would have ever told me in sales if I was feeling burnt out. Like you just need to like go for a walk or like get a good night's sleep or grab some coffee. They would have been like, I don't know, work harder. But in software engineering, it's like a widely held belief that like sometimes you just need a break, and that's at all levels. And I think that's especially true in the beginning, is that if you're like hitting a wall, be okay with that. Don't feel like I'm failing, I'm not good at this. Just be like, okay, I'm frustrated right now, like maybe I just need to like walk away from the screen for a few minutes, because that is a skill that you will use, as far as I can tell, forever as a software engineer.
It absolutely is. And how many times have I been at that wall hitting stage only to return and find out I've used color instead of background color in CSS or something?
Yeah,
And
totally.
just takes a few minutes of, stepping away. And then you're like, oh, yeah, it was that. So
Yeah.
excellent tip there. My calendar has told us about an interesting type of interview in their company called Team Fit. It's nothing technical, and the purpose is to determine how well the person would fit on the team. Wondering, Caitlyn, if you have any tips for tackling such an interview and how to make the best out of that, I guess.
Yeah, I think Team Fit is, I've heard that, and I've also heard more recently like Team Ad, or there's like something else, because for a while there was an idea of Team Fit where it almost felt like it was kind of discriminating against people, because if it was like, this is a team full of white tech bros, a Team Fit might look like another white tech bro. Whereas like if your team is looking for like a team edition, or like, I think it's like there's a balance there, because it's like you do want, like the team I'm on now, they specifically asked for humor in the cover letter. And I think that was one way that they looked for like a team fit in that way. It's like they want someone who's like more lighthearted, or, likes to like, we're writing code, we're not necessarily saving lives here. So it's like you, even when you're frustrated, like make light of it or that kind of thing. I think that was a way in which they look for a team fit. But then it can also, and so that I think can control a lot with your attitude and how you approach problems, and feeling comfortable. For me, because I do like to joke, feeling comfortable joking around in interviews. It doesn't have to be this like stiff interview. You want to kind of show your personality and what you'd be like to work with. And then I think as companies like look for more like team ads, they're looking for someone with like a different background, whether that's educational or whatever. And I think like the only way you can like really do like play into that part of the interview is just to really try to be yourself, which can be hard because interviews can feel so stiff. But if you don't show that, you might be at risk of being, like not, they wouldn't know how you'd fit into the team if you're not kind of like making some connections personally or showing that part of you.
Yeah, and don't forget that this team fit business can work both ways. Well, so can all interviews really, but especially the team fit one. It's also letting you find out if this is a team you even want to work in. It might not be, or it might be. So yeah, look at it as an opportunity, not a test.
Definitely.
Brilliant. A couple of people have asked about the old imposter syndrome, and there is a section on this in your book, which I believe is called Balancing Confidence and Imposter Syndrome. What would you like to tell us about that side of things?
Yeah, imposter syndrome I've definitely had it at least at the beginning of every job I've started. Usually lasts for me for a couple months and then pops up and goes away over time, off and on. It's hard because it just feels so normal to me. I don't know. I don't want anyone to get too down on themselves when they feel this way, because I think I did a Twitter poll at one point that was like, have you ever felt imposter syndrome before? And there was like thousands of people that responded, and it was like 95% yes. It's just for some reason it's a big thing in tech. And maybe that's because there's so much to know. And so you always feel like, how can I know so little when there's so much to know? I've definitely felt that multiple times. Like, oh my God, how long is it going to take me to like learn this new language? Like, I don't understand this thing at all. Like, when am I ever going to like know everything? And for one, you never will know everything. And I think that's a really cool part about being a software engineer. Like, I think one of the things is to like look at your seniors on the team you're in once you're on a team, and realize that they don't know everything either. I think once I realized that, it helped me feel a lot better about imposter syndrome, because for a while I felt like I would go to people who had been developers for longer on the team, and I would expect that when I asked them a question, the answer that they gave me was like the answer. And then I realized that sometimes they were wrong, and I was like, that's crazy. And and I think it just is like, it was great to realize, because I was like, oh, like nobody knows everything that's going on. And it's like, you want to build confidence. So I think like I've worked with my current manager on this. If I am feeling imposter syndrome, or I'm like, maybe I worked on something recently that I felt like I totally failed at, and I was like, I have no idea what's going on. I'm way over my head. I was just feeling so down on myself. The next thing that I would work on, it would be something that I knew how to do. That was like kind of easier for me. And so I think like that's one of the things for me that I reach for, is when I'm feeling imposter syndrome, I'll try and work on something that I feel really confident about tackling, and then I'll tackle it, and then I'll be like, oh, that was so great. And it helps me like kind of build my confidence back up after feeling down. And so I think like imposter syndrome, it just feels like part of the industry, but just try and find a balance where you don't get stuck in that hole for too long. And if you are feeling down, I hope that you have a manager who's very supportive of that and knows that that's such a common thing in this industry, and will hear you out and suggest a path forward to feeling a little bit better.
Yeah, totally. And you said correctly that imposter syndrome is pretty prevalent across the tech industry, and you ran a poll that got 90+%. Yes, I've had imposter syndrome. I've often wondered if this is something unique to tech just because of the amount of stuff there is to know in tech, or does everyone get imposter syndrome? It's just that if you're a doctor or a lawyer or a politician, you wouldn't necessarily say, actually, I don't really know what I'm doing, because that wouldn't really instill trust in yourself. But is it just all humans, or is it tech? Interesting thought experiment. Yes.
Yeah. I would think it's all humans personally. I just think like, because in tech, everything is changing so often, I think we're reminded of it more often. Whereas like maybe if you're a teacher, you have like a ton of imposter syndrome in the beginning, but then you get a curriculum down, you have some tools that you can use over and over again. And it gets a little better. And in tech, it's like you can feel better about it, and then something new comes out of the blue and you have to use new technology. And you're like, oh, here we are again. Totally new area that I know nothing about.
Yeah, that's true, actually. I mean, in medicine, for example, yes, there are new discoveries and whatnot, but I don't think it's quite at the rate of the constant change
It doesn't
we
move
have
as
in tech.
fast. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, we're up to the hour already, which is amazing. Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and of course, to Caitlyn for your wonderful answers. I would like to draw everyone's attention to Caitlyn's book once more, which is pretty much everything she wished someone had told her when she was doing her boot camp. Here it is, and we have a special Screw and Bird discount, which is super kind. Thank you, Caitlyn. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a great chat, and I hope it was helpful for folks. And I don't know, you can, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at the Kate Code. Kate, like my name is spelled.
Right, here is
Oh yeah, there
Twitter.
you go.
Also in the description box, as is the link to the book too. Yes. I will be back on Friday with Michael, coding a memory game. So come along and watch the coding carnage. That will be fun. And I thought, here we go. I'm speaking to Katie Code Stuff next week about leveling up your tech career and getting to that next level. So join us for that as well. Thank you all for coming. And don't forget, 2 things actually. Hit subscribe for more interviews like this. And let me know in the chats and or the comments if you're watching the recording, not live, who you would like me to speak to next. Yes, who I can invite next. But for now, I wish you a happy rest of the week, and make sure you all keep coding. Bye for now.
Bye.